I saw Matthew go with his sister Ella trailing him like a devoted pet. "Mia, you have to look after Mom while we're away." Without even turning around, he shouted over his shoulder, "Don't mess it up." My shoulders slumped as I exhaled deeply when the front door slammed shut. 4 weeks. I spent 4 exhausting weeks by myself with Matthew's bedridden, silent mother, Evelyn, who had expressed her disapproval of me ever since the day I married her son 5 years prior. Fearing what lay ahead, I ascended the stairs to her chamber slowly. Evelyn's wrinkled, pallid face was as blank as ever as she lay still on the bed. I said, "Well, Evelyn, it looks like it's just you and me," without anticipating a response. Slowly, the first week went by. She stared straight ahead without a word as I changed her bedding, bathed her, and fed her. The creak of the old house was the only sound to break the deep silence. Something changed on the 8th day. Her skeletal fingers sprang out and unexpectedly tightened its grasp on my wrist as I bent over to adjust her pillows. For the first time, her piercing blue eyes were alive and keen, and I gasped as I stared into them. "Enough of this act, Mia," she murmured in a scratchy, hoarse voice from silence. "We have work to do." My head swirling, I froze. Evelyn sat up, sliding her legs over the edge of the bed with sure, steady movements. I stumbled. "How? How are you?" "I've been pretending," she said, breaking off with a tiny, sardonic grin, acting like a helpless old woman to escape dealing with that miserable family. She began to describe, and as she spoke, I found it difficult to believe what I was hearing. I never imagined the depth of Matthew's betrayal. I was deeply shaken by the web of deceit, cruelty, and manipulation that Evelyn had been concealing. I started to feel a strong sense of resolve. As I added, "I always knew they weren't normal, but this is insane," my voice became more irate. "How could you have allowed them to treat you in that manner? You're their mom." Evelyn's expression grew stern. "They took away my money, my authority, and my dignity when I first tried to oppose them. It was already too late when I noticed what they were doing." Her cold eyes locked with mine. "That's why we have to stop them, Mia, before they do the same to you." I felt cold. Was it always Matthew's intention to keep me apart, to make me totally reliant on him and his family? My stomach turned at the thought. I said, "Start from the beginning," in a steady but irate voice. "I need to know everything." And so she told me. She revealed a dark story of greed and betrayal. It all started with her late husband's inheritance, which had torn the family apart. Matthew and Ella slowly turned on Evelyn, working together to take her money and control her life. Little by little, they stripped her of her assets, forcing her into a corner where she had no choice but to rely on them. As I listened, my blood boiled. The people I thought I knew were far worse than I could ever have imagined. But now Evelyn and I had a chance to fight back, and I was ready. I watched Matthew walk away, his sister Ella following closely behind, like an obedient puppy. "Taking care of Mom is your job while we're gone, Mia. Don't mess it up," he tossed over his shoulder without even looking at me. The front door slammed, and I let out a long breath, my shoulders sinking. 4 weeks alone with Evelyn, Matthew's bedridden mother, the same woman who had shown me nothing but contempt since the day I married her son. The days blurred together until one evening Evelyn grabbed my wrist with shocking strength. Her sharp blue eyes locked onto mine for the first time. "Enough of this act, Mia," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "We have work to do." I stared at her, stunned. "You've been pretending?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, playing helpless so I wouldn't have to deal with my miserable family. But it's time to fight back." As she spoke, the truth poured out like poison. Matthew and his family had been manipulating her for years, stripping her of money, power, and dignity, all while pretending to care for their poor, helpless mother. My shock turned to rage, tears burning my eyes. "Those bastards," I spat. Evelyn squeezed my hand. her voice calm but firm. "That's why we have to fight back. They won't see it coming." A plan began to form, the pieces clicking together like a dark puzzle. We would follow Matthew and his family to Maui and catch them in the act of whatever scheme they were plotting. Evelyn said she knew someone who could help, a former private investigator named Nicholas. "Can we trust him?" I asked as Evelyn dialed the phone. She shot me a reassuring look. "Nicholas is one of the good ones. He'll help us take those snakes down." The call was short, and by the time she hung up, a sly grin had crept across her face. "He and I," she said, "have been waiting for some excitement." A laugh escaped me, sharp and unexpected. Who would have thought I'd ever be part of a revenge plot? If Matthew could see me now, I thought. The thought sobered me, but Evelyn noticed and squeezed my hand. "I know it hurts," she said softly, "but we can't let them win." Her eyes hardened. "They think we're weak, but they're wrong. It's time to fight back." Her words lit a fire in me. For too long, I'd let Matthew and his family push me aside, but not anymore. This time, we were taking control. 2 days later, Nicholas arrived. He was a slightly rumpled man in his 40s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. As Evelyn introduced us, I studied him carefully, looking for any sign of deceit, but his warm smile and gentle southern drawl put me at ease. "Don't worry, Mia," he said. "We're going to bring those lying snakes down." We got to work right away. Nicholas was a whirlwind of phone calls and searches, digging up details of Matthew's upcoming trip to Maui. "Your husband loves his luxury resorts," Nicholas muttered, scribbling notes, "but we'll use that against him." Evelyn and I leaned in close as Nicholas circled something on his notepad with a triumphant grin. "Got it. They're staying at the Grand View Resort. Fancy place, but that just means more staff to bribe." Evelyn smirked. "Excellent work. Now let's figure out how to get there quietly." Nicholas was thorough, covering every detail: fake IDs, forged documents, everything we needed. By the time Matthew left another pathetic message on the answering machine about extending their stay, we were ready. The morning we left, I stood outside my little house, squinting into the bright Arizona sun. Once this house had meant everything to me: love, family, a future. Now it was nothing but a shell, a reminder of all the lies I'd lived with. With a determined shove, I tossed my suitcase into the trunk and slid into the back seat beside Evelyn. She looked strong and unshaken, no longer the frail woman I had cared for. She was ready for battle. As Nicholas pulled out of the driveway, I turned back for one last look at the house. It faded into the distance, a strange sense of finality washing over me. I felt like I was shedding an old, broken life and stepping into something new, something stronger. We were no longer helpless. We were ready to fight. I watched Matthew's back as he sat at the table, dressed to impress in a linen suit that screamed wealth. Beside him, Ella draped herself in jewelry, looking every bit the spoiled aristocrat. And then there was the blonde, the same one Lily had seen by the pool. Her presence made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was not the time to lose focus. As Evelyn and I approached the table, I felt her tense beside me. Years of betrayal had led to this moment, and I knew she was barely holding back. Nicholas's steady hand on my elbow kept me grounded, his quiet support giving me the courage I needed. Matthew looked up first, his face twisted with confusion before shifting to panic. Though he tried to mask it, "Ma," he stammered, his voice barely steady. "What are you doing here?" I smiled a cold, deliberate smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Oh, I thought it was time for a little family reunion, Matthew." My voice was steady, calm, dripping with just enough venom to make him squirm. Ella's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing like a predator sensing trouble. "What's this about, Maya?" she asked, her tone sharp. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice clear and unshakable. "It's about you, Ella, and Matthew, and the little scheme you've been cooking up behind everyone's backs." Matthew's face went pale, his usual smug expression replaced by thinly veiled panic. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, don't play dumb, Matthew," I replied, crossing my arms. "We know everything, your affair, your plans to frame me, and your pathetic attempt to steal what's mine. You really thought you'd get away with it." The blonde looked between us, clearly uncomfortable and confused. Ella's lips thinned, her jaw tightening as she snapped, "You don't have proof of anything." Nicholas, who had been standing quietly at my side, finally stepped forward. "Actually, we do," he said, dropping a manila folder onto the table with a loud thud. "Photos, recordings, financial statements, it's all here." Ella's face drained of color, and Matthew looked like he might be sick. I relished the moment, watching their carefully constructed lies crumble around them. For the first time in years, I felt powerful, unshakable. "You're finished," Evelyn said, her voice calm but icy. "You won't be able to talk your way out of this one." Matthew's panic finally erupted. "You don't understand. It wasn't like that." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it, Matthew. I'm done listening to your lies." The blonde stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse. "I'm not part of this," she muttered, throwing Matthew a disgusted look before walking away. I almost laughed. Even his mistress didn't want anything to do with him now. Ella turned on me, her voice low and furious. "You think you've won. This isn't over." "Oh, it's over, Ella," I said firmly, leaning in so she could hear every word. "You've spent years tearing people down, but not anymore. This time you lose." Nicholas handed me a phone already dialing. "Time to call the authorities," he said quietly. Matthew's face contorted with anger, but there was nothing he could do. He had no power left, no control. The truth was out, and there was no running from it. As I turned to leave, I felt Evelyn's hand squeeze mine. "You did it, dear," she whispered, her voice soft but proud. I looked back one last time, taking in the sight of Matthew and Ella, broken and defeated. This was justice, long overdue, but finally here. As we stepped outside into the warm Maui night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was free, no more lies, no more shadows. And as far as I was concerned, Matthew and his family could rot in the mess they created. Justice was ours, and it felt glorious. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch as the truth settled like poison in the air. Matthew sat slumped, his face pale and hollow, while Ella glared daggers at me, her lips pressed into a thin line of rage. The once smug, manipulative duo now looked small, like children caught in a lie. I turned to Lily, her tear-streaked face pale, as she tried to process the reality she'd been dragged into. "I'm sorry you had to find out like this," I said softly, my voice calm and measured, "but you deserve to know the kind of man you're dealing with." She blinked, stunned, before standing abruptly. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she whispered to Matthew, her voice shaking. "I thought you cared about me." Matthew didn't respond. He didn't even look at her. He just stared blankly at the table, as though the walls of his carefully built world had finally crumbled, leaving him exposed. With a soft scoff, Lily turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of diners. The sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor was like nails sealing a coffin. Evelyn's voice broke the silence, calm but razor-sharp. "I told you, Matthew, there would be consequences." Her eyes burned with a fire I'd never seen before, every ounce of her strength and fury focused on her son. "I let you push me down once, but not again. You underestimated me." Ella opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "Don't even try it," I said, my voice steady but cold. "You think you can twist this around, pretend to be the victims again? It's over. You can't talk your way out of this." Nicholas, standing quietly behind me, placed the folder of evidence on the table. "Everything's here," he said. "The photos, the conversations, the financial records. You too thought you were so clever, but you left a trail of breadcrumbs anyone could follow. The authorities will have no problem connecting the dots." Ella's face turned a mottled red, high anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You think you've won," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Mia." I laughed, soft and bitter. "I think I've spent enough time regretting things, Ella. But you'll have plenty of time to regret everything." Matthew finally looked up, his eyes hollow. "You don't understand," he said weakly, his voice trembling. "We did this for the family, for what Dad left behind." Evelyn's laugh cut through the room like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. "Don't you dare invoke your father's name," she spat. "He'd be ashamed to see what you've become." Matthew's shoulders slumped and he fell silent again, defeated. I straightened, feeling a strange weight lift from me as though years of anger and fear were finally leaving my body. "You've spent so much time pulling the strings, thinking you could control everything and everyone around you. But you were wrong," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You've lost." Evelyn rose from her seat with a grace that belied her age, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "Let him go, dear," she said, her voice soft but full of triumph. I nodded, sparing one last glance at Matthew and Ella, two broken figures slumped in their seats, the fight drained from them. For so long they treated us like pawns, but now the game was over. As we walked out of the restaurant, the murmurs of the other diners buzzed around us, whispers of scandal and disbelief. I didn't care. Let them talk. The truth was out now, and there was no hiding from it. Outside, the warm Maui air wrapped around me like a fresh start. I turned to Evelyn, who looked stronger and more alive than I'd ever seen her. "We did it," I said quietly. She smiled a slow, satisfied smile. "Yes, dear, we did." And as Nicholas joined us, his eyes crinkling with quiet pride, I finally let myself breathe. The battle was over and we had won. For the first time in years I felt free. No longer a pawn, no longer a victim. Matthew and Ella could try to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, but it wouldn't matter. The truth was theirs to live with now, and I had no doubt it would haunt them forever. As for me, I was finally free to start over, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. As I looked over the broken remains of the Owens family, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The weight I'd carried for so long, the hurt, anger, and years of resentment, seemed to vanish. In its place was a hollow sort of pity. These weren't powerful people. They were small, sad individuals who had destroyed themselves chasing money and status. By trying to control me, they had lost everything: their wealth, their reputation, and even each other. The flight back from Maui passed in a blur. Evelyn and I sat side by side in the emergency exit row, sipping tiny bottles of bourbon and soaking in the silence. For the first time, there were no more threats lurking in the shadows, just the promise of a new beginning. Nicholas had assured us everything was under control. With his connections and the mountain of evidence we had gathered, the legal side of things would be handled. Matthew's lies, schemes, and betrayals would catch up to him in the end. As for me, I didn't care about pressing charges or dragging it out in court. I was done fighting. All I wanted was to move on. Back in Arizona, the first thing I did was put the house up for sale. It didn't take long to find a buyer. Matthew's family had chosen a house in a prime location. As I handed over the keys, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness watching the new owner beam with excitement. I whispered quietly, "Try not to make the same mistakes I did." With the house sold, Evelyn and I had to decide what came next. That evening we sat in a booth at a local diner. Maps spread across the table as we sifted through apartment listings and ideas for our fresh start somewhere new. Evelyn murmured, her finger tracing the map. A clean slate far away from all of this. I nodded, fully comprehending. His deception destroyed my ambition of starting a family in the suburbs and establishing a life with Matthew. Perhaps it was time to move forward. to begin anew in a place free from the specters of the past. Any ideas? I inquired. As Evelyn looked at the map, her eyes brightened. I've always wanted to see New England in the fall, you know. The crisp air and the shifting colors of the leaves. It appears to be a lovely location for a fresh start. The image she painted of the two of us surrounded by red, orange, and gold-painted trees, at last at peace, made me grin. I concurred. New England it is. We spent the following weeks preparing to leave Arizona. We looked at employment opportunities, looked for tiny towns in the Northeast, and sold or gave the remaining of our possessions. It became simpler to let go of the past with every step. I took one more stroll through the deserted house the morning before our departure. I stopped upstairs in what had been our temporary war room. The walls that had housed our retaliatory tools, maps and photographs, were now empty. This place had seen a lot of betrayal, rage, and retribution, but it was all over. The past would remain in its proper place. As I turned away, a smile tugged at my lips, bittersweet. I was prepared this time for whatever was yet to come in New England. I made a commitment to face the future with courage and open eyes. I knew I could survive everything after what Matthew and his family had thrown at us. I felt lighter as I down the stairs than I have in years, relieved of the weight that had been on my shoulders. Evelyn was waiting for me in the corridor. Her grin was warm and knowing, her face serene. With quiet power in her voice, she said, "Ready, dear?" I smiled back and nodded firmly. Ready. Together we left the shadows behind and walked out the door. The time has come to welcome the light.